Starting off this countdown, we have Thomas W. Lawson. Thomas W. Lawson was a British stockbroker who in 1907 published a book called Friday the 13th. The story was about a stockbroker who tried to make the entire stock market crash on Friday the 13th, hence the name of the book. Little did he know that he would eerily predict the future. On Friday, December 13th of 1907, a ship named Thomas W. Lawson, named after a completely different Thomas W. Lawson, not the author, set sail on her first transatlantic voyage. That day, she sank. Isn't that bizarre? A ship named Thomas W. Lawson crashed and sunk on Friday the 13th. I'm telling you, this guy predicted the future whether he meant to or not. In our ninth spot, we have the dollar bill. Now, this is a pretty wholesome one for you all. When a woman named Esther was young, she had written her name on a couple of dollar bills after a bad breakup. She then told herself that she was going to marry the man that brought the bill back to her. Well, years later, she was dating a man named Paul Gratchen. The day he asked Esther to be his girlfriend, they were at a sandwich shop. As he was paying for the meal, he got handed a dollar bill with the name Esther written on it. The bill she wrote years prior. And in the end, they ended up getting married. Now, how wholesome is that? The universe literally gave her what she had manifested. Coming in at number 8, we have the girls with the red balloon. In 2001, a 10-year-old girl named Laura Buxton decided to release a red balloon from her front yard with a message on it. The balloon said, "Please return to Laura Buxton," and it had her address written on it. Well, this balloon traveled 140 miles and ended up landing on the yard of another 10-year-old girl's house. This girl's name was also Laura Buxton. Like, what are the odds? The two Laura Buxtons ended up meeting and they discovered that they had tons of similarities, not just their age and name. For example, they both had a guinea pig, a gray rabbit, and a 3-year-old chocolate lab. They both also looked alike and dressed alike. I'm telling you, this is just way too freaky. Like, what are the odds? I'm gonna be saying that a lot in this video. What are the odds? Moving on to number 7, we have Mark Twain and Halley's Comet. Every 76 years, Halley's Comet is visible to the naked eye as it soars past Earth. Well, American writer Mark Twain was born on one of Halley's Comets passing in 1835. The next year that the comet was said to pass was in 1910, and Mark Twain predicted that he was going to die that year. He said that he came into the world with the comet and that he was going to leave the world with the comet as well. And Mark Twain was right. Mark Twain passed one day after the comet's closest approach in 1910. So not only did Mark Twain predict his own death, but his birth and death both seamlessly lined up with Halley's Comet. How freaky. In our 6th spot, we have Violet Jessop. Violet Jessop has been named the luckiest woman as well as the unluckiest woman. She also has been given the name Miss Unsinkable, and I'll explain how she got those nicknames in just a second. So Violet was a stewardess and nurse who was on board 3 big sister ships when disaster struck each of them. It started with the HMS Olympic. She was on board the ship when it collided with the HMS Hawk. Then she was on the HMHS Britannic when it struck a mine at sea. And lastly, she was on board the Titanic, and she managed to escape all 3 of these disasters. At this point, she probably was cursed, and after the first accident, she shouldn't have gotten back on any ships ever again. So that's why she's been given the name the luckiest, unluckiest woman to live. She's been lucky to survive all the accidents, but unlucky that they kept happening to her. We're now at our 5th and halfway mark with Daniel du Toit. The irony behind this next story is mind-blowing. So Daniel du Toit was a South African astronomer. Over his life, he discovered and co-discovered several comets. He also spent his days giving lectures. On September 28th, 1981, he gave a lecture on how death can strike anyone at any time. As soon as the lecture was done, he popped a mint into his mouth. The mint then slid to the back of his throat, he choked on it, and died right then and there. So yeah, I'd say his lecture was pretty spot on. In our 4th spot today, we have Harry ZIEGLAND. Now, this story is kind of controversial. Some say it's an old wives' tale. Others say that it actually did happen. Now, if it did happen, then this is the definition of karma. So back in the day, there was a man named Harry ZIEGLAND who broke a woman's heart. She was so heartbroken that she took her own life. Her brother was so devastated and angry at Harry that he vowed to get revenge on him. So he went out to find Harry with his gun and shot at him. Harry fell to the floor, and the brother, thinking that he had succeeded in killing him, grabbed his gun and took his own life. But Harry survived. The bullet didn't strike him. Instead, it hit and got lodged into a nearby tree. 3 years later, Henry was using dynamite to remove the tree. When he blew it up, the explosion sent the bullet out of the tree, and it hit and instantly killed him. It took karma 3 years, but it finally caught up to him. Coming in at number 3, we have the Hoover Dam. Over the course of the construction of the Hoover Dam, there were 96 deaths. The first death was of a man named J.G. or George Turney. It occurred on December 20th, 1922. He sadly lost his life after drowning in the dam. 14 years later, on the exact anniversary of this guy's death, his son, Patrick Turney, lost his life. He fell from an electrical tower and died. This was also the final death reported during the construction of the dam, meaning the first man to die and the last man were father and son, and it happened on the exact same day. Coming in at number 2, we have Jack Frost and Other Stories. Some things are just meant to be, and you'll believe this once you hear this next story. Children's book author Anne Parrish was with her husband in Paris when they stopped by an antique bookshop from the 1920s. While in there, she found a copy of Jack Frost and Other Stories. She told her husband that that was her favorite book as a child. Well, when he opened the book, it had her name written inside of it. It read Anne Parrish, 209N Weber Street, Colorado Springs. So not only did it have Anne's name in the book, but it had the place she grew up in, Colorado Springs. Seems like Anne was meant to find that book. And in our number 1 spot today, we have the 2 presidents. It turns out that Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy share a lot of eerie coincidences. Besides the fact that they both were American presidents, they both were killed by a gunshot wound to the back of the head. They both passed away on a Friday. They both died before a celebration. Kennedy was assassinated on the eve of Thanksgiving. Lincoln died right before Easter. And each were accompanied by their wife and another couple when they were killed. But that's not all. They both had best friends named Billy Graham. Both Billys had 4 children, and they both had secretaries named after the other president. Kennedy's secretary was Miss Lincoln. Lincoln's secretary was John. But wait, there's even more. Both of their successors were vice presidents called Johnson. The freakiest coincidence, Lincoln was shot in Ford's theater. Kennedy was shot in a Lincoln made by Ford.
Kicking off the list at number 10, the Hoover Dam coincidence. We'll kick this list off on a grim note because why not? The Hoover Dam, okay, this massive accomplishment. Its first victim, sadly, was a man named J.G. Tierney. It was December 20th, 1922, and the official death toll from industrial accidents during the construction of the dam from 1921 to 1935 was sadly around the 200 number. It was a lot of deaths, it was pretty sad. The earliest and latest victims of the construction were both father and son. And if that's not coincidence enough, both of them died on the exact same day. They both passed on December 20th. J.G. Tierney sadly drowned while conducting surveys in the Colorado River, and then 13 years later, Patrick Tierney fell off an intake tower right before construction was complete. Grim start, but stay tuned, we have a lot more.
Moving on to number 9, we have the start and end of America's Civil War. In July of 1861, Wilmer McLean's Virginia home was involved in the first battle of Bull Run. In fact, the general of the battle wrote a diary entry about a cannonball crashing through McLean's kitchen. He wrote, and I quote, "A federal shell fell into the fireplace of my headquarters at the McLean house." Now, due to safety reasons, McLean moved his family home from the front lines to a new home in Appomattox County. Well, guess what? The battle ended up ending in his parlor in 1865. So it started in his backyard and ended in his parlor. So he was involved in the beginning and the end. Moving on to number 8, we have the birth chart. This story was shared by Raina Lee R on Reddit. So according to her, her brother's doctor would always get his chart mixed up at the office. And that's because there was another kid under his care with the same first and last name. To make things weirder, they were both born on the same day, just different months of the same year. And their mothers had the same name. What are the odds of that? I'll be saying that a lot in this video, so get used to it. But for someone to have the same first and last name as you, it's absolutely wild. And the same doctor. I just hope that they met and became best friends. Coming in at number 7, we have The Marks. This story was shared by Pata95Nishta on Reddit. And this story is about to blow your mind. So according to her, her best friend from elementary school has 3 sisters. All 3 sisters grew up to marry engineers. Not only that, but all of their husbands were named Mark. And her best friend, I guess, followed this tradition because when she got older, she also married an engineer named Mark. What are the odds that all husbands' names were Mark and all of them are engineers? This is wild to me. Like, did the sisters do that on purpose? Are all engineers just named Mark? Also, that must be so confusing at family get-togethers and dinners. In our 6th spot, we have the meteor. So it said that the odds of being hit by a meteor is 1 in 840 million. So the odds of this happening are very, very, very slim. It's next to impossible. Well, the impossible happened to a family in France. One night they were hit by a meteor, which had been flying through space for more than 4.5 billion years without hitting a target. Then all of a sudden it just crashed into their home. Thankfully, no one was hurt. The odd part here is that the family's last name was Comet. So, out of all families and homes to hit, it hit the family with the name Comet. That is truly bizarre. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with Anthony Hopkins. In the early 1970s, Anthony Hopkins was casted to play Koista in The Girl from Petrovka. This film was based on the book of the same name. Now, to prepare for the role, he was going to read the book. However, he was unable to find any copy of the book in any bookstore. He searched all over the place, but to no avail. Then, randomly one day, as he was sitting in the London tube station, he found a copy of that book just laying around. Not only that, but when he opened the book, he found that it was signed by its author. Literally, the universe brought him what he was looking for. What are the odds of someone leaving that book behind and then Anthony finding it? The very book he was desperately looking for. Coming in at number 4, we have The Close Calls. In 2014, Dutch cyclist Martin de Jong had plans to head from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur. He was scheduled to be on Malaysia Airlines Flight 17. But before his flight, he bumped his ticket up to catch a later flight because it was cheaper. That is the airline that was shot down while flying over eastern Ukraine. All passengers lost their lives. That's not all. In March, he had a flight from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. Again, he decided to bump his ticket up at the last minute to get a cheaper deal. And it's a good thing that he did. He was scheduled to be on Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, the one that disappeared, never to be seen again. So Martin escaped death twice, all because he wanted a better deal and saved some money. He's a lucky, lucky man, but also unlucky that he was supposed to be on both of those flights. In our 3rd spot, we have the plum pudding. Mathematician Joseph Mazur shared this creepy coincidence involving French poet Émile Deschamps with plum pudding in his book Fluke. So back in the day, a man named Émile was first introduced to plum pudding by a man named Mr. de Forgebus. From that moment on, every time he had plum pudding, he would encounter Mr. de Forgebus, and I hope I'm saying his name right. The second time he had plum pudding, he was at a restaurant and ordered it, but the waiter was like, "Sorry, we just sold the last pudding to this man," and points to the back of the restaurant. Lo and behold, it was Mr. de Forgebus. A decade later, he went to a dinner party, and at the party, they were serving plum pudding. Émile made a joke like, "Who's this party for, Mr. de Forgebus?" And at that very moment, he walked through the door. But he wasn't even supposed to be at that party. He had accidentally come to the wrong door on his way to another dinner party. So what are the odds that every time that this man had plum pudding, Mr. de Forgebus was there? It's kind of like Beetlejuice, you know, you say his name 3 times and he'll appear, except in this case, you have plum pudding and he'll appear. Moving on to number 2, we have Flight 666. Now this one gives me the absolute creeps. On Friday the 13th, Flight 666 departed from Copenhagen and landed in Helsinki, aka HEL, hell. Let me say that again for you. Flight 666 flew to hell on Friday the 13th. I don't know about you, but if I was scheduled on that flight, I would cancel immediately. I ain't taking no chances. But thankfully, the flight landed safely in Helsinki. Thank gosh it did, because that seems like one cursed flight. It's plain creepy how it lined up exactly like that. pun intended. Get it? Plain creepy. And in our number 1 spot today, we have the prediction of James Dean's death. On September 30th, 1955, James Dean died in a car accident. He was only 24 years old. And it seems like a man named Alec Guinness actually predicted this would happen. He warned Dean and said, and I quote, "If you get in that car, you will be found dead in it by this time next week." A week later, Dean was involved in a terrible car accident and he sadly lost his life. In fact, Alec had said that the car was sinister, and I think he's right. Later, parts of the car were recovered and resold and placed into other cars. All the car owners who had parts of James Dean's car were also involved in deadly crashes. Not only that, but the mechanic working on the car died after the car rolled off the back of a truck and crushed the legs of the mechanic. So Alec was onto something here and tried to warn Dean. Starting off this countdown, we have Jean-Marie DUBARRY. On February 13th, 1746, a French man named Jean-Marie was executed for the murder of his father. Hundreds of years later, on the exact same day, a man named Jean-Marie DUBARRY was also sentenced to death. He had also taken the life of his father. So what are the odds that 2 unrelated people with the same name both killed their fathers and then got executed on the same day? Like, that is just way too freaky.
Number 9, legendary musical neighbors. It's weird how similar some of your neighbors are, right? Like growing up, we had 3 Davids on our street. They all loved cutting their lawn at 7 a.m. What a coincidence, right? We all hated them. What a coincidence. Well, the 60s rock icon Jimi Hendrix and the 18th century composer George Friedrich Handel, they were both neighbors. A couple hundred years apart, but they were both neighbors indeed. They lived in 23 Brook Street and 25 Brook Street in London. What are the odds, right? Had George had been born 200 years later, we would have gotten the greatest collab of all time. Yeah, if you're local, of course you'll know there's a site there now. It's a famous landmark, but in terms of coincidences, there's music in the air on Brook Street. Something's going on. Kind of want to walk by and see if I'm better at playing the flute. Maybe I could play the flute on that block, who knows. Number 8, same taxi, different tragedy. Okay, here's a dark one, buckle up folks, pun intended. Back in 1975, a man was sadly hit by a taxi in Bermuda. Now he of course sadly did not make it, all the while a passenger in the taxi witnessed the entire horrible event. Now that's life-changing in itself, that's trauma, right? A year later though, the same driver was driving the same passenger when all of a sudden, the taxi hits another civilian. That civilian just happened to be the initial victim's brother. Ugh, horrible. This is some Final Destination stuff. I don't like it at all. Like this, what are the odds here, really? Let's move on to something a bit nicer, a bit. Number 7, same day, different vows. Okay, brightening up the mood a little bit, bringing us all back to happy land. CBC News reported this one. It's a little nicer of an ending. Fred and Lynette Dubendorf, husband and wife, they were taking a stroll down the beach with their dog, living up the life, right? The classic. When they noticed a message in a bottle had washed up on the shore. Now personally, I wouldn't be too excited, right? I'd be a little concerned. I've seen Castaway, you know? This message could go one of 2 ways. I have no idea. Like what's gonna be in here, right? Like help, 1876, you're like, oh no. But they opened it and inside they found wedding vows from another couple, Melody Kloska and Matt Bears. They had recently got married on a beach in Lake Michigan and word spread rather quickly. Thing is, their wedding date was the same as the couple who found the message. That was the bizarre coincidence here. So they took it as a sign that both pairs were meant to be and they sent a surprising letter to the lost couple's address. It's kind of nice, but it's also kind of creepy, you know? It'd be creepy on one hand. Hey, I found that message in a bottle. Cool, nice address, lovely home. Cool, I'll be back in a bit, hope it works out. Who puts their address on a message? That's just asking for disaster. Number 6, $1 marriage. The story of Esther and Paul Gratchen. Okay, this one goes out to all the single folks out there, okay? Keep hanging on. Love's coming, it's out there. See, Paul had decided on asking Esther to marry him, and around the same time, he caught himself about to spend a $1 bill on a sandwich. But the dollar bill randomly had the name Esther on it. Okay, so he framed it. Obviously, this was a bizarre coincidence, and Paul recognized this. And when he showed Esther later, she was speechless, right? She loved it, but she didn't tell Paul her side of the story until after they tied the knot. See, much earlier, when Esther and a group of friends were all going through a breakup, they wrote their names on a dollar bill and said, whoever brings this bill back to them, they'll marry that man. Now Esther didn't tell Paul the full story until after they got married because, well, she was worried this coincidence would have scared him away. Yeah, more than fair. Hey, I have a dollar bill and it's your name on it, so we have to get married now. You're like, what? Bye. Number 5, Civil War coincidence. There's another war coincidence in this list, but I saved that for number 1 because it's too good. But this one here is also pretty insane. The Civil War began in 1861 with the First Battle of Bull Run. The Bull Run is a stream that passes through the farm of a 46-year-old Wilmer McLean. Passes through his farm, right? The Bull Run is a stream that passes through the farm of a 46-year-old Wilmer McLean. This property was in Virginia. Now, of course, once the dust settled, the property was destroyed, so McLean left his home with his wife, and for nearly 4 years, the pair were considered safe while the war was otherwise changing history. Then in 1865, the war came to a close when Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse, which at the time was literally steps away from McLean's new property. Yeah, he saw the beginning and the end of the Civil War by accident. He saw it front row too. What are the odds? Number 4, George D. Bryson. Back in the 50s, this story was spread all over Kentucky. Back in the 50s in Louisville, a man named George D. Bryson was checking into a hotel room. Now he walked up and asked if there was any mail for him, which on one hand is an excellent bit. I'm gonna do that next time I go to a hotel for sure. Hey, got any mail? Classic, because you're just visiting the one time. There's no way there's gonna be mail. That's the joke, right? Except this time, there was. This time the hotel manager said yes, and there was in fact mail from the previous occupant of the room, who had also had the same name, George D. Bryson. Yeah, what are the odds, right? I remember one time I met another McWaters, and he was not related to me, and he also was not thrilled that we had the same name at all. It was the most bizarre thing. I was like, hey, can we talk about this? He's like, yeah, cool. I'm like, are you my brother? I don't want you to be anymore. Get out of here. Then I got Kyle, and I was like, you know what? Change your name. Now you're my new brother. Replace this guy. Number 3, Yanny and Laurel. Before we wrap up this curious list, we have to throw a fun recent one in as well. Remember this Yanny Laurel thing back in 2018? I only heard Yanny for like 2 weeks straight. I heard Yanny. That's it. For 2 weeks, guaranteed. I was determined that it was Yanny, okay? And then one day I listened and it was Laurel, and then I couldn't go back. It was just Laurel all of a sudden. Like, it immediately just changed. It was a completely different word. I felt sick. I was like, is this real life? How is this happening? This got everybody talking. What is this phenomenon that happens? Same with the dress mishap. What is going on? Well, many believe these viral illusions are proof that we're living in a simulation. Yeah, these arguments, the dress is blue, no it's white, these situations prove that we perceive reality in our own individual way. Everybody is living an individual perceived reality, so sometimes it doesn't always align. Sometimes we hear what we want to hear. Sometimes we hear Yanny, and then sometimes we hear Laurel, and it's completely different for some reason. I can't go back now, it's the worst. God, I hated this so much. The dress was back in 2015, then Yanny Laurel was 2018. I don't know, we're due for another glitch in the matrix any day now. I come back next week, I have a different first name all of a sudden, you're like, what? Number 2, miss unsinkable. It's one thing to narrowly miss a natural disaster or a massive accident, but to not miss a tragedy 3 times in a row, that sounds like a curse if you ask me. That's for sure a curse. Violet Jessop, this brave soul, survived 3 major ship disasters in history. She was born in 1887 in Argentina, and Jessop contracted tuberculosis at a young age and wasn't expected to live longer than a few months. She beat those odds and lived a healthy, relatively long life, which is shocking considering what I'm about to tell you. Violet, first of all, had a hard time getting hired as a stewardess on a ship because her youth and good looks were feared to distract crew and passengers. Yeah, you're too good looking to work on our ship. Welcome to the 1900s, I guess. Eventually, she got hired in 1910 to work aboard the HMS Olympic. Now, a year later, the Olympic collided with HMS Hawk, and the ship barely made it to shore. It was a tragedy. It was a huge disaster. Violet then served as a nurse aboard the Britannic right before World War I. The ship then collided with a German mine, and Violet jumped overboard and somehow survived with a fractured skull in the water and swam to safety. Afterwards, Violet worked on the Titanic, and on April 14th, 1912, she escaped another disaster on lifeboat 16. I mean, like, the odds that you survive 3 times in a row is one thing, but to experience 3 of those in a row? Huh. And finally, number 1, World War I soldiers. We have to finish on a grim note because this one is one of the most bizarre, in my opinion. When the First World War ended, the amount of British lives lost were around 1 million souls. The first reported casualty of World War I was a soldier named John Parr. And then after a countless number of lives were lost, the last soldier to die was a man named George Edwin Ellison. Now, both heroes' resting places are both in the St. Symphorian Military Cemetery, and they just happen to be 15 feet apart. And of course, this was not planned, nor were any of the entries on our list. It's just another bizarre coincidence that was discovered after the fact.